Hey, everybody. Welcome to this very special retrospective episode of the Behavioral Observations podcast. The podcast has turned 5 years old, and I've known the 5th anniversary of the show has been coming up for a while, and I've been racking my brain about, kind of how best to commemorate this milestone, and I ended up settling on this decision to replay session 1, kind of where it all started. That's my interview with Dr. Greg Hanley. In this episode, we discussed the origins of what is now referred to as the practical functional assessment approach. Way back when it was referred to as the IISCA, and I think in the show I even said that IISCA. It's this show was recorded, I think sometime in the fall of 2015, and published several months later, obviously in February of 2016. But I wanted to replay the show for a few reasons. Even though the PFA process has gone through some refinements over the last few years, and there's been more literature supporting it, in this episode, Greg kind of takes us back to the beginning and talks about the reasons for developing this approach, and certainly acknowledges that he is not the first person to kind of tinker with the standard functional assessment model, if you will, of functional analysis. The second reason for sharing this conversation, again, is that every day new listeners are coming in contact with the podcast. And even though I get emails from folks saying that when they find the show, they go back and binge the back catalog, I find it hard to believe that folks will actually go back and listen to all of them. And so for those who haven't heard this one, I think this would be a really interesting show to give another listen to, or give a first listen to, I guess, in this case. And then lastly, this particular episode is the most downloaded episode when compared to all the other shows I've published. And as of this writing, this show has been downloaded over 56,000 times, about 15,000 times more than the second most downloaded show, which incidentally is also with Greg Hanley. So for all those reasons and more, I really hope you enjoyed this conversation with Greg, whether it's for the first time or if you're dusting it off for a re-listen. And again, a huge thanks to Greg. He's been just so generous with his time and just an amazing supporter of this podcast. He really helped put Behavioral Observations on the map with his contributions to the show. On a broader note, while I'm in the, mode of giving thanks, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about my thoughts on the show turning 5. It's not an understatement when I tell you that creating this podcast has been a life-changing experience for me. And I really actually struggle with using that term life-changing. And I was thinking to myself when I was writing this out, I was like, is that really hyperbolic? But it's not actually, after reflecting on it, it's certainly life-changing in a professional sense. I started this show kind of as a cure for mid-career burnout, if you will. And that was before I knew what burnout was and before it was a fashionable term and all that stuff. But it really re-energized my passion for behavior analysis. And it just became a really enjoyable thing to do, to have these really fascinating conversations with all these experts. And so, professionally, it's just been an amazing experience for me. And even personally, some of my best friends are people I wouldn't have met if it weren't for the podcast itself. So, so for all those reasons and more, this has had a profound effect on me. And there are so many people who've helped me along the way. There's been so many listeners. I get emails sometimes from folks saying, hey, I've been a listener since day one. I've listened to every single episode. And that's like 200 hours of content probably. There are people out there who listen to all my filler words, awkward silences, vocal fry, nervous laughter, the whole 9 yards. And I just can't tell you how much I appreciate that. It's awesome. All kidding aside, I'm just grateful to everyone who shares these episodes with friends and coworkers, and of course supervisors and professors who force their mentees and students to listen to the podcast. All kidding aside, it's just mind blowing that this show, people are using it to learn more and kind of supplement their study of this science that we all know and love. I've also had countless people support the podcast financially, if I can be candid here for a minute, whether by purchasing CEUs or subscribing to the Patreon, sponsoring episodes, or inviting me to speak at events. So, the ability to generate some revenue from behavioral observations allows me to put more time into the show. And for all those people who've helped with that, I am just incredibly, incredibly thankful. And it's always a danger to, I guess, list specific people when providing thanks in situations like these, because, what I don't want to do is inadvertently leave someone out. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings and things like that. But in addition to Greg, there's one other person that I have to take a minute to mention. It's likely someone you haven't heard of. It's my good friend, John Corley. John's not a behavior analyst. He's a programmer and data scientist, and he's just a good friend of mine. And I remember talking about starting a podcast with him over a couple of beers, sometime in 2014 or 2015. And he was insanely enthusiastic about it and would not let me kind of give it up, if you will. So were it not for his obvious technical support, and I still call on him from time to time to help me with issues with my website and things like that, and his just general encouragement about starting the show, this podcast would have remained a daydream, and all those good things that I just mentioned wouldn't have come to fruition. So again, I'm incredibly grateful to John's help and basically providing the kick in the pants necessary to get this thing going. So and his help and support since then. So huge thanks to both John and everyone else who's played a part in getting this show to nearly 2.5 million downloads in the last 5 years. I could say thank you a million times and it wouldn't be enough. And I look forward to sharing great conversations with you for the next 5 years and beyond. So before we get to Greg's interview here, I do want to take care of a few pieces of business. This episode is sponsored by the Virginia Association for Behavior Analysis. They are hosting their annual conference. It's coming up, it's coming up on April 15th and 16th, and it's both going to be a safe and socially distanced in-person event, as well as available online. So if you want to check that out, you can go to virginiaaba.org and click the conference button. And if you do decide to check it out and register, use the promo code GOMBU, which is a nod to their conference sponsor, Mary Baldwin University, to save at checkout. I'm also throwing a big continuing ed sale over at the Behavioral Observations Continuing Ed store. So from now through the end of the month, use the promo code 5 years to get 55% off all your CE events over at behavioralobservations.com/get-CEUs. And then last but not least, if you are interested in checking out the Patreon, you can go to behavioralobservations.com and click the Patreon button, and you can get an ad-free version of this show by signing up. So that means that you get right to the interview with just a brief introduction to the show. So you won't be listening to me do what I'm doing right now. There are also great discounts for all sorts of stuff, most notably 20% off discount for continuing education over at FTF. So to learn more, go to behavioralobservations.com and click the Patreon button. And I think that'll, again, do it for opening remarks. Sorry to get a little long-winded here, but I thought it was appropriate to take a few minutes and talk about the show and what you all have meant to me. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. So I guess I'll stop talking and get to this interview. So without any further delay, please enjoy session 1 of the Behavioral Observations podcast, my conversation with Dr. Greg Hanley. This is the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everybody, it's Matt Sikoria here. Welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast. In this episode, we spend about an hour chatting with Greg Hanley from Western New England University. In particular, we talk about his unique approach to functional assessment. It's an approach that's quite a bit different than how we have been traditionally taught to do functional assessments. So I think there's going to be a lot of noteworthy content in here for us practitioners out there in the field. During this episode, we also talk a lot about how Greg got into behavior analysis and things like that. And for those reasons, I'm going to skip giving you guys a lengthy introduction or biographical background on who Greg is. And quite frankly, he tells the story a lot better than I do. But before we get to the interview itself, we do have a sponsor here. The Behavioral Observations podcast is sponsored by bside21.org. bside21.org is an ABA news site with hundreds of articles connecting behavior analysis to our world in a non-academic format. And I would check them out at bside21.org. That's bsci21.org. In a later episode, actually, I interview the editor-in-chief and owner of bside21.org, Dr. Todd Ward. And we do talk a lot about how to disseminate behavior analysis in this new world of expanding media and things like that. And I think that's a pretty interesting conversation. But for the time being, you can, again, find them on the web at bside21.org. So having said that, let's get on with the interview. Greg Hanley, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me, Matt.
This is a real treat because I've followed you for the last couple of years. I think the time about which you came onto my radar screen was a few weeks after I attended a intensive 2-day workshop on functional analysis with Brian Iwata, and I saw you give the keynote speech at the first APBA conference in Boston not too much later than that.
Gotcha.
What was cool about that is that, you know, in those span, I think, of about 2 weeks between those events, I got a lot of, encouragement, motivation, or what have you, to incorporate the use of functional analysis in my practice way more than I had been doing previously. And I think one of the things that I've heard you speak about in the past is that, you know, the traditional training is that, or at least it had been as of, years back, is that, you know, you do an interview, you do some observations, and if you can't nail down the function, and if you can't do this, and if the intervention's not working, then you might consider possibly doing a functional analysis. And the outcome, at least that I got from both of those, both of your talk and the workshop from Brian, was that, you know, you actually need to do the opposite. In fact, when I was sitting in Brian's workshop, he went through all the data that basically looked at descriptive assessments and how they can be misleading and things like that. And I was sitting in a room with probably about 50 BCBAs, maybe more, and we're all kind of looking at each other like, oh my gosh, we've been doing it wrong. So it's with that in mind that I saw that kind of first talk of yours, and I this might have been, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, prior to your development of the IISCA procedure, or IISCA, I think, as you're calling
it was. We were on the verge of developing it. We were implementing it in some practice context, but you're correct. We had not named it nor come public, if you will, with the model in a peer-reviewed process, nor in any kind of presentations. But it was just before then. We were having those conversations and those interactions with families, though.
But the gist of your talk, I think, was seemed to be heading in the right direction. In other words, I wasn't terribly surprised when you started, bringing some of this research out, in that you were really just saying you don't have to do, the full multi-element, in other words, it was do something.
That's right. It was the message then, I believe, was be analytic. And there are many pathways to successful analysis. There is not one way. And if you're in practice, don't run from analyses because you think you have to have, for instance, 5 conditions, run it out X many sessions. But you can be analytic more efficiently And then the other part of the message was clearly there's a lot of front end stuff we do as behavior analysts that probably doesn't serve us too well. And if anything, maybe even misleading, like some of the correlations from descriptive assessments or the correlation from indirect interviews. And so I think those were the messages. They're more what you don't have to do. And then I think a few years later, we really developed, well, then what should you do? What are the essentials to a complete functional assessment process that'll put you on the road towards effective treatment? And that's what we've been really examining the last 3 to 4 years.
Great. I want to get more into that, but I also want to step back for a minute and talk a little bit about how you got into behavior analysis.
Okay, great. Like anybody in our field, I came in through the back door, kind of a historical accident. What's nice is meeting young people nowadays who say they wanted to be a behavior analyst because they met one when they were young, or they came into their home and saw them in school. And that's really neat. But guys of our generation, I guess, it's usually an accident. So mine was, my father was a telephone man, and their charity organization was called the Pioneers Group, and they ran Special Olympics in Rhode Island. So I participated in Special Olympics for years as a referee or an umpire or a coach. So I was around a lot of folks with developmental disabilities. And my older brother managed group homes, and so he gave me my job in the summers while I was in college, and I would do direct care work. And while I was trying to get into medical school after undergraduate, I did a lot of direct care work. Then I managed group homes for the Groden Center for young men with autism. And I kept thinking this wasn't for me. I was trying to get into medical school. My grades weren't good enough, so I had to continue to take classes and whatnot. And during that time, I also met my current wife. She's always been my wife. And she was working in Baltimore at the Kennedy Krieger Institute. And when my contract was up, I went down simply to live with her and to look for a job. And Wayne Fisher gave me a job. He interviewed me, told me he was going to have group homes from the Kennedy Krieger Institute. That never materialized. Thank goodness I got to work on the neurobehavioral unit. And I'd say that's really where I became a behavior analyst. I was doing behavior modification beforehand in group homes, various group homes in Rhode Island. But at the Kennedy Krieger Institute, I really learned about Skinner and Java and just really fast-acting independent variables that created meaningful change. So that's the short story about how it happened. I have to tell you a slightly longer version, and that is...
Yeah, go ahead. This is a podcast, so, this...
Great. Well, Wayne, I actually met Wayne because I was painting my row home rental with my girlfriend at the time, Rachel Thompson. He came to pick her up for a Christmas party, and we met. And he wanted me to interview there, and I really didn't want to work in the same place as my girlfriend, but I reluctantly went for the interview, and it was really impressive what I saw. But Wayne actually hired me and Kathleen Piazza to paint their children's basement, and so I actually painted their basement and did a fairly terrible job, as I recall, but they were kind enough, and they paid me, and I got to know them better and knew, well, these are great people, and no matter what they're doing, this is the place I want to work, so... It's kind of a neat side story.
Yeah. It's just amazing the different routes that people take. So, you started working in group homes, and now you're, a full professor. And, did you imagine you'd be going to places like, Switzerland and Italy and
no, it's very strange. Yes.
You have to pinch yourself sometimes, and I'm on a plane to such and such place. And
yeah, I do feel very lucky. I always say that, especially because of the worldview behavior analysis gives you. It's a kind of a peaceful worldview. I'm very fortunate to have kind of accidentally stumbled upon that. And sure, all the opportunities. People ask me, do you want your kids to be behavior analysts? And to be honest, I have mixed feelings. I want them to have the worldview. I want them to be able to have satisfaction in their job like behavior analysts do, and we help people. But on the other hand, it's also a tough gig. We're a young field, and there's so much to do that it's a pretty burdensome job in that respect, because you're pulled in many, many different directions. But I wouldn't change it. I have absolutely no regrets. I'm very thankful I did not end up getting into medical school. Thank you, poor grades, because it set me on this course.
Yeah, that's I guess that's the glass half full
Yeah,
perspective, and it
that's right.
seems
That's right. I'll have that every now and then.
more than half full. It seems like it worked out okay. Great. So let's turn to this IISCA formulation. Was there a particular case? Or I guess what I'm curious, what were the conditions that kind of occasioned the development of this? Were you just not satisfied with what was? Well, let me just stop and let you answer the question. I'm just curious how it came about.
Yeah, no, I think you rounded out the question correctly. I do want to point out that it's really something that was developed over many years and not by me. There are examples of what are components of the IISCA strewn throughout the Java literature and other good behavioral literature. And I just was fortunate to be around great mentors that taught me different ways of approaching similar problems. And then also having opportunities to work in a great journal like Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, I got to read a lot. And so I got to see a lot of things coming in the door. And that also helped shape, I think, this thing we call the IISCA. The name IISCA is horrific, and I understand that. It stands for Interview-Informed Synthesized Contingency Analysis. Many people in the peer review process have encouraged us, as a soft version of the word, to change the name. And the reason why we really struggle with that is because it emphasizes doing open-ended interviews before we design analyses. And to us, that's critical. People say, well, most people do analyses before interviews before functional analyses, but it's hard to see the extent to which they're informed, because then people simply cite an article from the 80s and say, well, we did it just like that. And that's clearly not informed in a qualitative sense from the interview. And the second part is we are so into breaking things down into their components because we're behavior analysts. That's what we do. But I think we've been breaking things down in unnatural and unnecessary ways for a while. And so the other part is the synthesis of contingencies. And what that really refers to is just emulating the contingencies people describe to us as probably influencing behavior and not trying to microanalyze them, separating positive from negative reinforcement when perhaps there's no need to do so. So that's why the awkward name is the way it is. We want to interview those two bits, the informing the analysis from an interview and synthesizing contingencies when the story suggests we should do so. But back to answer your question, I was doing functional assessment, descriptive assessments primarily before I came to the Kennedy Krieger Institute. Like most people do in practice, I was wowed by the understanding that could be obtained through analysis. To be able to turn behavior on and off was just incredible to me at the moment. And it was very compelling. On the other hand, I also noticed there was a lot of strain in the conditions when we ran them in a uniform sense. And the uniformity makes good sense because you want to be able to communicate across studies. And so that uniformity made very good sense in a way to protect the field and kind of learn as a group. But for the individual participants, sometimes the analysis just felt very strained. And the child would have a break, and they would have a break to nothing, and they would continue at a problem behavior, but I was trying to isolate that contingency. And so we persisted, but go ahead.
Can I pause you there for a sec? Okay.
Yep.
So let's go back to the part where you say the break between sessions or conditions. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that you finish, say, like an attention condition, for example, and then the kiddo would still be engaging in problem behaviors between session 1 and session 2, or session 6 and 7. Or were you trying to get
there was that, but no, what I was really referring to, Matt, was the break. Like if we were testing to see if problem behavior was sensitive to negative reinforcement, and we presented an instruction following problem behavior, we let the child have a break from that instruction. I was referring to that kind of break where during that time period, problem behavior would often persist, and the child would have a break to nothing. And even back then, I would think, well, nobody takes a break to nothing. You know, when you call out sick from work, you terminate that aversive event having to go to work, but you do things. You watch movies, you do something of the sort. And so even back when I was wowed by the power yielded by analysis, I still was a little, a little frustrated because I thought sometimes the conditions weren't emulating the stories that parents were willing to tell us about what was happening with problem behavior.
So
Even when I
was
went
it-
to, go ahead,
Was it
Matt.
too contrived? Is that what you're saying?
Uh, I never worried about the contrived part. People always say, well, the contrived part, but thinking back to it, perhaps that's it. But the contrivance was not being in a session room, not being with a stranger. That's the behavior analyst. The contrivance that I had most issue with was the fact that we are breaking apart social interactions in uncomfortable ways because we're looking at the controlling variables through a particular lens. Is it social? Maintain my social positive, social negative, or automatic? And sometimes that lens didn't allow us to look for qualitative details of controlling contingencies that we thought probably were operating, but we ignored because we were doing something of a standard nature. Even when I went down to the University of Florida and studied with Brian Awada, and that was an incredible experience, and he was a very supportive advisor. Even when I did analyses down there for some of my own projects, I would do casual, unstructured, open-ended interviews, and I would run test control peers as my analysis. And we published some studies together with that format in place, where we would only test the contingency we thought was influencing behavior, and we would have a nice matched control condition. But nevertheless, I stepped away from functional analysis for a few years when I was at University of Kansas, and we did other things. But when I came back to New England, we had a lot of families that wanted assistance with severe problem behavior. And so we just looked at the literature and started practicing more in that area. And then we settled on this model. And the model is basically we do an open-ended interview, we let people talk, we extract the contingency, and we emulate it in a test control analysis. And that usually takes us one visit to do an interview, one visit to do an analysis. And then from there, we're teaching. And so we've had a little pushback from it, which makes good sense because people are saying, yeah, but you don't know the actual contingencies controlling behavior. If in your test condition a child escapes to toys and attention, you don't know whether it's any one of those reinforcers. And my response a few years ago was, well, it doesn't matter because the child's properly motivated to learn in that test condition. If they're willing to punch their face or punch me, I have a properly motivating set of conditions, and then I can go off and teach. I can teach communication, teach toleration, teach them to comply with adult instructions, all within that context where apparently I don't know everything. But my response was always, well, I know enough to effectively treat. And we're supposed to be pragmatists. That the truth is an effective action. If I can effectively treat behavior off a synthesized contingency, then that's the truth. Maybe I don't need to know more than that. Mm-hmm. But what was interesting as we did more research on this, as people gave us pushback, we said, okay, let's compare synthesized contingencies to isolated contingencies in more traditional formats. And what we've really come upon by accident is that there's a whole bunch of interactions that control problem behavior, and you can't see the components controlling problem behavior when you isolate them in a standard way. So what I mean by this is we have some kids, you do a test for attention, and there's no problem behavior. They're not engaging in problem behavior just to get your attention. We would do tests for escape, and they would simply do the work. They would not engage in problem behavior to get a break. We would remove toys. They would not engage in problem behavior to get the toys. So there were no main effects of attention, escape, or tangibles. But then we would synthesize them. And so the child would have his toys removed, instructions imposed, and if they engage in problem behavior, they'd get a break and toys and attention, meaning a synthesized contingency. And lo and behold, we saw problem behavior sensitivity to that contingency. This seems very strange because none of those components were reinforcers on their own, but when synthesized, stitched together, combined, they served as reinforcement for problem behavior. And that was really an aha moment for our group. We realized, these times where we get undifferentiated results of standard analyses, it's possibly because we're breaking things down to an unnatural point. And when we build them back up to how they present in the natural context kids exist in, we're seeing behavioral sensitivity. So that's really I guess, some of the history that's given rise to this thing we call the IISCA and why we're fairly well committed to it.
Okay, that's a pretty good rundown there.
That was a mouthful.
No, it's good stuff. So I'm just trying to, kind of process this a little bit, and it sounds to me like you are describing problems associated with transitions, because as almost all behavior analysts who work with kids with challenging behaviors have found, when caregivers describe the circumstances in which problem behaviors occur, very often transitions are part of the issue. That is to say, they might have kiddos might have challenging behaviors when they have to, come in from recess, when they have to leave study hall to go to math class, when they have to put something down to go to the carpet for circle time, and so forth. Is that fair to say?
I think it's a great point. And we don't necessarily conceptualize this as issues of transitions, but I think we certainly could. It's just a different framing. It's similar in the sense that we know when there's a combination of a worsening and another worsening, that seems to be what's evoking problem behavior. So in other words, the first worsening is someone approaches you looking as though they're going to interrupt what you're doing right now, that apparently is reinforcing you're doing it. And second, they're going to impose their will on you in some way, have you, again, move, wash up, do some other work. And so I do think that a lot of times problem behavior is evoked when there's more than one establishing operation in place. And whether that involves a physical transition or just a pretty formidable change in the environment, that seems to be what's responsible for a lot of problem behavior. Now, we don't see that in the literature, because the literature, we haven't looked for it. We really haven't looked for interactions because we've been so hyper analytic. But now that we're looking for it, we see it time and time again. And so I'm looking forward to seeing this in the future, how people might also start looking for the environmental events that combine, that give rise to problem behavior, rather than trying to isolate and trying to find the main effects of these things we know have been historically reinforcing for others. I like to give this metaphor to my students. I love coffee cake. I don't know if people outside New England know what the coffee cake is. It's a beautiful cinnamon buttery kind of cake I eat with coffee in the morning. And I love coffee cake. I'll go to drive to the store to get coffee cake and to the bakery, but I normally don't eat flour. I don't drink vanilla. I don't take spoonfuls of cinnamon. I don't eat sticks of butter. Okay, so the components of coffee cake are not reinforcing. And so sometimes the components of our social contingencies are not reinforcing. But when you put them together, they're reinforcing. And that's really the basis for the synthesized contingency.
Like hops, barley, water, yeast.
Right on. Yeah, you name it. Yeah, I sometimes use the metaphor of a whiskey drink. I like a whiskey smash, but I don't eat mint on their own, lemon on their own. I try not to drink whiskey on its own, get myself into trouble. So yes, things together are better. And that's all we're trying to suggest. Now, we still have a lot of research to do on the conditions under which we synthesize or isolate. And so it's an exciting time in that regard. But as far as when push comes to shove and I'm called in to do a functional assessment, I do an interview and I take that story and I stitch it together into a single test condition. And I don't apologize for doing so because we're pretty effective treating off those baselines.
So, Greg, it might be unfair to ask you this question, given that you've written so much about this, but would it be okay if you gave us an overview of this process, or at least a thumbnail sketch of it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I haven't actually written that much about the process. That's what's upsetting, perhaps, to some people, because we seem pretty passionate about it, despite we don't have hundreds of articles on it. We do have a lot of articles coming out and being submitted. We'll see if they come out. And so eventually there'll be more in the literature, but I'd be happy to talk more about it. Basically, when we do a functional assessment process, our aim is to simply identify a set of motivating conditions to teach skills. That's our treatment. So we do functional assessment really with treatment in mind, which is the spirit of it. And we also are about safety and efficiency. And so the process looks like we always start out with a semi-structured, open-ended interview. And in that interview, we're asking normal questions, non-technical questions, and asking families just to tell the story about problem behavior. And then from their stories, we try to extract the contingency. So we might ask a question like, if there were $1 million on the table and your son was having a meltdown, what could you do to make that meltdown stop? Is there anything you could do to turn off that meltdown? And when they say, oh, sure, I could give him his iPad and dote on him and make sure I don't ask him to do anything related to hygiene, then okay, I'm hearing the establishing operations. I'm hearing the reinforcers in those stories. And from that, we then do an analysis. And the analysis just has two conditions. One is the test, and that has the contingency we think is influencing behavior that the parents describe to us. And the control is designed from the test. It has the same person, same place, same materials, except the reinforcers are provided the whole time. So there's no contingency. And we usually see a difference within 25 minutes, which is basically 5 sessions. We'll run a control session, a test, a control, and then 2 more tests. 3 points make a line for the test, and that serves as our baseline from which to progress towards treatment. So there's a little more to it than that. And what I would encourage anyone who's interested, who's listening to this and is interested, I set up a website, and it has the assessment tools we use. It has tutorials, PowerPoints, workbooks, and it's for no charge. And our whole mission is to disseminate this process. And the website is practicalfunctionalassessment.com. There's no spaces. And I would just encourage people to go there and check out the different links on the website. And there's also videos from practitioners who have implemented the process, and they show basically how benign a functional analysis can be when it's properly informed by an interview and when we stitch together the controlling variables. So I'd encourage people to hit that website.
Yeah, and I would second that, because that's where I have gone to learn a lot about these strategies as well. And it's laid out very nicely and certainly has a lot of great resources there. We will provide links to the website to direct people to there as well when we do the post-production on this particular episode, so people can know where to go. Awesome. Now, you have talked about this in the context of providing treatment for kids with developmental disabilities of one sort or another. I remember in one of the talks that you were giving, I think it was one of the YouTube things that you would link to on the website, one of the YouTube presentations, that you said you also do some work with kids with psychiatric disorders. Do you use the same procedure? Because that is and with any functional assessment workshop I've ever been to, there's not an insignificant number of people in the crowd raising their hands to say, yeah, but I work with, fill in the blank, disability, or does it, and certainly that's been a criticism of the functional assessment process, from the get-go, in terms of these are procedures that were developed with, either individuals with spectrum disorders or, significantly developmentally disabled, et cetera. So what's your experience, if any, dealing with these types of matters in other populations?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, people are right in that the functional analysis technology has boundaries, and the boundaries are often related to language abilities and cognition. We don't see a lot of typically developing adults, for instance, participating in functional analysis procedures, and specifically a functional assessment in general. Nevertheless, we apply the IISCA to children of any IQ, any language abilities, and we do see kids who have psychiatric diagnoses, especially things like bipolar disorder, where they're engaging in severe problem behavior, but they do not meet criteria for an autism spectrum disorder. And in our neighborhood, the bipolar disorder seems to be growing and being becoming more common. For those children, we do the same exact procedures. And again, they're cognitively, there's no difference cognitively with their same age peers. If anything, they tend to have higher IQs, some of these kids with bipolar disorder. And we use the same procedures. Now, as we move up and people get larger and larger than me, which isn't hard, and larger than some of the behavior analysts running sessions, we do make a tweak to what we do in the analysis. And that tweak, that change, is that sometimes we provide reinforcement for people's mans. We do not wait until it escalates into problem behavior. So if we have someone who's very large and very language able, and we go to remove a preferred activity, and we say, you know what, we're going to do something laborious right now. We're going to do some work that we full well know the young man does not like to do. If he says, ho, no, I do not want to do that work. I want to keep doing what I was doing. We say, no problem. Okay. Now, the man might be a little gruff. It might be a lot ruder than what I just modeled, but nevertheless, we'll reinforce that. I won't say all the things that people say to us, obviously, but we'll start with where they are.
With mans that end in you.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. There's a fair amount of those put our way. So we'll start with whatever base man they'll engage in, and then we'll shape from there. So it's the same treatment process. It's just the starting conditions are slightly different. I'd really say that's the one of the main changes we'll make. Another change we'll make is sometimes we don't do the analysis. The kids that are slightly higher functioning, or at least have better language, they're reactive to us, but they behave in a more troublesome way with their parents, for instance. So we'll have the parents do the analysis under some of those conditions. Those are probably the main changes. Otherwise, we do the analysis as we would do with any child. But again, I want to make it clear, we do not do this process with typically developing adults. We do this process with children across any the spectrum, across any variance in IQ, and we do this with adults with intellectual disabilities or that perhaps are on the spectrum. So our boundary condition, I guess you would say, is age and IQ together. When they're old and are typically developing, those are the conditions under which we have not yet applied this, and we don't work with those sorts of folks.
Yeah, and I guess that would run into, perhaps the functional assessment, functional analytics, psychotherapy, territory or something like that.
That's right. That's right. And I'm not trained in that area, and I hope someday people kind of merge these sorts of approaches. But again, we're expert more in young children, kids with disabilities, or adults with disabilities, and we have no problem applying the IISCA process under all those conditions.
Well, that really speaks to the generality of the strategy. One thing that kind of came to mind as you were describing how you would reinforce just the mans of the highly verbal participants is that the idea of reinforcing the precursors to the challenging behaviors, not waiting to get whacked, or not waiting for someone to really hit themselves in the head. Or hit their head to a hard surface or something like that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I didn't mention that, but that is a core feature of the process. We ask questions in the interview about what behaviors tend to co-occur. They don't necessarily need to precede each other. We don't worry about their sequence as much as their mere co-occurrence. And there's some okay data out there already. By okay, I mean we could use more of it, but the studies that are in this area are great. And they show generally that when people report behaviors co-occur, they tend to serve the same function. And so in an interview, if we find out that the kid likes to threaten with his fist without hitting or stomp their feet, we love hearing that. And so we would be happy to reinforce that in the analysis rather than aggression or self-injury. We understand that we're taking an inferential leap. If we know it's reinforcing stomping and we never see aggression, we're making an inferential leap that which is controlling foot stomping is also controlling aggression. But there's studies out there by Rick Smith and Churchill and Brandon Herskovich and Eileen Roscoe that show that when the reinforcers or precursors, they so far have been the same as the reinforcers for severe problem behavior. And I really think that part that Smith and Churchill introduced us to years ago in Java, that is a critical feature of being able to be analytic in schools and in homes. If in your analysis you keep the establishing operation in place until there's a complete meltdown, that is going to be a troublesome situation that you might not be invited back to again. But when you reinforce precursors, it's a fairly peaceful analysis, and it allows you to see sensitivity to the reinforcers you suspect controlling problem behavior, and allows you to move right towards treatment. And I understand that some analysts they say, well, you didn't demonstrate directly the reinforcing relationship with the environment and the problem behavior. And sometimes as a practitioner, you have to figure out what you need to know and what you can get away with not knowing. And to me, that's the critical element of being a good practitioner. It's not always about being hyper analytic. I like to tell my students is there is no truth out there. There is no true function. There is simply context from which we can effectively treat in. And our job is to find those contexts and effectively treat. And there's a whole lot of things I don't know about the controlling variables for the problem behavior that I don't need to know to be effective with treatment. And so that's the struggle I think we all face as practitioners. What can we get away with not knowing?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a real humble approach too. How could we possibly know everything that's going on with this particular kiddo or this particular client or what have you? And so especially hearing someone in the academic world saying that, as a kind of a Joe Sixpack or what have you, that's heartening, because it's that you're making sure your students have that perspective in mind, is that and that you don't have to, it's perhaps another way of saying I'd rather be effective than right, or
that's
certain,
right. That's right. Or to be effective is to be right. I mean that's really our motto. I mean, that person who's effective is correct. But again, there's going to be some studies coming out of Java trying to figure out the validity of these different approaches. And it's more complicated than it seems at first blush. To establish the validity of something, you really need to have treatment effects, because that's where it all lies. He or she who's most effective kind of wins in this area. But those are extended, expensive studies that as a field, we're just about to, take on.
I see. As a practitioner, I had, who has done functional analysis and have had to introduce the concept of a functional analysis to people who aren't familiar with it and who've had the more or less involved, if you will, assessments done in the past. They sometimes look at you with three. You're going to what? You're going to create conditions under which problem behaviors occur, and of course that's my way of describing it. And at least in shorthand, And so the idea of reinforcing at the precursor level, I think you're right, that would go some ways away to mitigating it, and also following up with the decelerating conditions, if you will, to make sure you don't do what you don't become the grandparent in terms of you get the kid all fired up and then it's time to go home. And so one of the thing too, and this is something that I've done in practice as well, is just because I'm not taking data to publish or anything like that, is that if I'm responding right away in a condition, I don't have to go 10 minutes. I'm using, air quotes here, because that's the way, I've been taught to do it. That, if we're seeing responding right away and that there's some sensitivity that's being displayed, that, because sometimes we'll be reinforcing precursors, but they'll still continue to deteriorate into more severe challenging behaviors. At least that's been my experience with some individuals I've worked with. And so it's like, oh gosh, we're good. Is that something that you would recommend?
Well, you brought up a heck of a lot of good points. I agree with you that you should be nimble when you do your functional analysis. If you see the contingency controlling behavior just beautifully, in other words, the EO is presented, you get a precursor or even a problem behavior, you reinforce, it turns off immediately. You put the EO back in place, it turns on immediately. You give the reinforcer, it turns off immediately. You probably don't need to run more than a 3-minute session. And so we go in saying, let's run 5 minutes, but I'm so impulsive. Sometimes I'm just like, shut it down at 3 minutes, and then we'll go to control for 3, and then go back to test for 3. So yeah, I think we want to do everything we can to minimize the amount of time so we can spend more time teaching skills, which is the treatment takes a long time if you're committed to skill-based treatment. But you said something else that I want to talk about. And for me, if we provide reinforcement in the analysis and that precursor or problem behavior does not turn off, we stop the analysis and we go back to the drawing board and we interview more or perhaps even observe more to figure out what we missed in the contingency. Our rule of thumb is the control condition should not be low, it should be 0. When in the test condition, when the child has reinforcement, behavior shouldn't be low, it should be 0. And if we're reinforcing quick enough and completely enough, again, back to that whole idea of synthesized and contingency, it really should be off during those 2 periods, reinforcement interval in the test and the whole duration of the control condition. And we never used to worry about those things. We always just said, well, if we get a difference between test and control, we know the function. But now we have a higher standard, and that is if it's persisting in control, we don't know enough about the controlling variables. Let's go back to the drawing board. It's almost though if you go to treat and you don't have 0 levels in the control condition, you know you're going to have to add arbitrary punishment or reinforcement because you know going in you don't have access to all the controlling variables. And so our, I guess, ability to turn on and off quickly is fairly important to us. And also you get the side effect of it. It maintains a nice orderly environment. It's safer when you have access to all those reinforcers. But I want to go back to an earlier point you made because it always makes me laugh. You said it seems really strange when you tell people, yeah, I'm going to take a child, I'm going to put them in a room, I'm going to evoke problem behavior, or they hear provoke problem behavior, and then I'm going to reward it. And it seems it's complete nonsense, I hope, to most people. And in fact, when I knew about functional assessment when I was managing group homes in Providence, Rhode Island, my girlfriend was at the Kennedy Krieger Institute, and she was doing analyses. And when she described them to me, I said, I just don't understand it. I don't understand why you take someone with severe SIB and put them in a room and reinforce their behavior. It just seems so counterintuitive. And we never argued about it. But I remember getting off the phone once going, I don't know if I can continue with this woman because that is some strange stuff. But we ended up continuing because she was bright enough to even teach me the logic behind it. And once I got to see it myself, I started to understand more. But when I talk to parents about it and teachers, I come out very quickly with how this is a counterintuitive set of procedures. And I talked to them about how safety is paramount for us and how we're going to get in and out quickly and move to teaching skills quickly. I think that helps. If people are still reluctant, I love to use the allergy test metaphor. And so I tell people, when you go to an allergist, they interview you to see what kind of things are in your environment that might be eliciting those responses. And then a good allergist will stick people with needles, and they'll see if there's a slight worsening in the symptoms. And that's what we do. We only see a slight worsening. It's not as bad as the actual response to the common allergen. And good allergists will do the same allergen twice. That's what we do. We replicate. Good allergists will have a saline pin, a saline poke. That's their control condition. Just like us, we have a control condition. So this is just good science that results in a tolerable but brief worsening of the problem, and that allows us to more precisely treat. And so I say, it's not common in our culture, but it's not without precedent either.
That's a good point. That's, I think, a good take-home analogy in terms of something we can, an actionable item, if you will, from that. So I appreciate that little sales tip, if you will. Maybe sales is probably too dirty of a word, but you get what I'm saying.
It is a dirty word, but we do have to do that.
Yeah, for sure. So Do you do anything special between conditions? You say, you do, okay, we'll do a couple of minutes in tests and we'll go back into 3 minutes control. And as you were kind of describing that sequence of events, just at the real practical basis, you've got a kiddo you're working with, you're in the room. Is there anything special that you do? I know, just hearkening back to some of the literature from, a few decades ago, it's like, with people with different colored T-shirts and different painted rooms, et cetera. Right. I know, What do you do?
Good. Those are great questions. We don't use any discriminative stimuli anymore. We don't use different colored hats or T-shirts or rooms, only because the test and control conditions they're really rely on the evocative qualities of the contingency, and so there's nothing to evoke behavior in the properly designed control condition. And the test condition, the behavior gets evoked whether or not there's a clear signal, historically relevant or otherwise. So we don't use any of that stuff.
Do you wait, or do you give them a break? Do they go up and get a drink of water, or or how does that? Just the functional piece.
Yeah, from the child's perspective, there's nothing going on that's different really across the 25 minutes they're in the room while we do an analysis. It goes like this. We start with the control session because it's all the child's reinforcers, and we want to start out on that right foot in case the child's reactive to the person in the room or the place, the new room. And so it's generally a play context, and they're getting attention and no one's instructing them to do things. That's typical. We'll do that for 5 minutes. Then when we transition into the test, there's a signal from data collectors, but it's not really signal to the child. And then the establishment operation is put in place. That goes on for 3 to 5 minutes. When that session ends, it usually ends on reinforcement. And if it doesn't, we go right into reinforcement. So the inter-session intervals are not signaled to the child, and it's just the control condition. So or reinforcement, which is for us the same. So the reinforcement interval in the test condition is the same exact thing as the control condition, which is what we do between sessions with the child. So it's basically, we call it a no EO condition, or continuous reinforcement condition. So that's a lot of language luggage, but let me answer it simply. Between sessions, we don't leave the room. We simply give the kid all the reinforcers we suspect are controlling problem behavior, and we hang out. And then when the data collectors are ready, there's maybe a tap on the glass or a hand signal, and we move into our next session. Really, the only reason we have session breaks is for data collection. And if we don't do live data collection, we're doing the analysis alone, we're just videotaping, we have no breaks between sessions. It's just a 25-minute sequence of 5 minutes control, 5 minutes test, so on and so forth.
Wow.
With higher functioning children, if they detect our signals, like the session's over and they hear a knock on the glass, they might say, I want to go out and see my mom, or I want to use the potty, or I want to get a drink of water. We honor that, obviously, and we'll take a walk, but we try not to have any breaks. And that's, again, part of our mission to make it fast. I mean, my goal is to get it so we can begin treatment in the first day, but that's exceptionally rare. Usually it's second visit where we can start our communication training.
Do you feel that you are able to evoke target behaviors that may be kind of low frequency but high intensity, given this set of strategies?
And that's a great question. That's something we're talking a lot about in our practice group. I always used to say one of the limitations of functional analysis is it's not applicable to low rate behavior. And that was said in publications, and people would agree, because it just doesn't make sense that in a 5 or even 15-minute session you'll capture a behavior that only happens once a week. What's the mathematical probability of that? But I have a completely different take on it nowadays, and I've started to think more about when problem behavior is low rate. Why is it low rate? Like, what are the conditions that give rise to low rate behavior? And some ideas are that aggression, for instance, only happens very intermittently because people don't present the evocative event. People learn not to present difficult instructions. They learn not to leave the child alone. It's the parent of the young child with autism that has a massive bag with them at all times, and they're constantly feeding the kids food and toys. So they really learn to avoid the behavior through non-contingent reinforcement. And it's low rate because those conditions are maintained with pretty good integrity. The other low rate is that people actively reinforce precursors. So when people say, yeah, aggression never happens, but when I'm watching the classroom, the kids gets frustrated and they provide a break. They say, oh, it looks like you need to relax.
Whoa.
And yeah. And so now that I think we're better understanding of why a behavior is low rate, it's not surprising that when we put strong EOs in our analysis, when they say behavior doesn't happen much, we're seeing it happen because we're not avoiding the evocative situation. We're systematically putting it in place. And then sometimes, again, we're not seeing the severe behavior either because we too reinforce the precursors. And so the take home here is that when people say, well, it's a low rate behavior, so I don't think we can do a functional analysis, I don't buy that for a second. We'll either see it because we put in a strong evocative event, or we'll get to see the precursors to it, and either of which will allow us to proceed towards treatment. So I tell people now, don't worry about its base rate. We're going to create it, or we're going to see what you see in the precursors, either of which will allow us to move forward.
So if you can't evoke those behaviors in session, is it just a cue to go back to the interview and get more information and so you can better understand? In other words, you might have missed the mark in terms of one of those evocative scenarios. Is that fair to say?
You nailed it. Yeah, you nailed it. Nothing fancy. What we do is we watch the analysis. Usually the parents are with us and we say, what are we missing? And we do an interview usually right there while the child's in our failed analysis. And the parents say, well, perhaps that's not the interaction. Sometimes we need to put a parent in there. Sometimes the establishing operation needs to percolate, be in place for longer. So sometimes they'll tolerate academics for a few minutes, but sessions perhaps are too short. But you're correct. And what we do if we don't see the behavior being evoked in 2 consecutive test sessions is we stop the analysis and we re-interview, or we watch the child interact with their teacher or their parent. Joshua Jessel, one of my colleagues, has a paper under evaluation at Java right now, but it's a IISCA replication paper. And I don't recall the exact numbers, but basically our first analysis is a hit, certainly more than 80% of the times. I think it's probably about 85%. And those times it's not a hit, it doesn't mean we go right to treatment. It means we re-interview, re-observe, and change the contingency. And usually, as you said, you nailed it, we're changing the evocative event. We had the wrong academics or hygiene materials. We did not have the right toy, or perhaps it wasn't about just averting our attention. We had to talk to somebody else to establish the value of our attention. And so through further conversation, we can usually identify that. By the time our second analysis, we usually have yielded some differentiated results. That's right on.
Very, very good. Well, I think I could probably ask you questions about this for an indefinite amount of time, but I know you've got to go here shortly. So perhaps we can have you back on and talk about some of the other topics. Obviously, assessment's one thing, but you've mentioned time and time again, it's the treatment that's really the challenge, if you will. Not that the assessment's not challenging, but certainly you spend more time in treatment.
That's right.
And so forth. I'd love to have you back on and talk about that. And certainly there's a whole a couple of other lines of research that you have, including prevention and so forth, that I'd love to pick your brain on. But for now, I think we're going to leave it there, and I want to thank you for coming on and sharing this really, really practical, useful information with us. So, Greg, thanks so much.
Thank you, Matt. It was a great chance to talk with you, and I look forward to talking with you again.
All right. Super. All right. That was some great stuff from Greg Hanley. I hope this conversation inspires all behavior analysts to be more analytic in how we go about assessing challenging behaviors. Now, it's one thing to do an assessment, but it's an entirely different thing to conduct treatment. Greg alluded to this a little bit. I was lucky enough to score another interview with him, so in a future episode, we'll talk a lot about how we use what we've learned in the assessment to drive treatment using a unique approach to functional communication training. I also want to reiterate the resource that Greg mentioned, his website, practicalfunctionalassessment.com. It is a treasure trove of terrific information on not only functional assessment, but functional communication training, as well as strategies for dealing with stereotypic behavior and sleep issues. So with that in mind, that's our show for today. For a summary of the strategic and tactical aspects of this approach, head on over to the website, behavioralobservations.com. Thanks for listening, folks. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.